The world did not rot. It remembered rotting. This was the first and fundamental law of the Upside Down, the irreducible principle of its being. It was not a place, not in any sense that a mind born of light and reason could comprehend. It was a process, a predatory pattern etched into the static-filled interstitial tissues between realities, a recurring algorithm of pure, distilled dread. It was a living equation where the only variable was the magnitude of the fear it could induce, and the only constant was the inexorable pull towards amplifying it. This dimension did not consume flesh or devour worlds in fire. It fed on the psychic resonance of trauma, the lingering, spectral echo of a scream that had faded decades ago, the indelible psychic stain of a nightmare that felt more real than waking life, the cold, forgotten sweat of a childhood terror buried deep beneath layers of adult rationality. It was a cultivator of fear, and fear was its soil, its water, its sun, its very breath. For eons beyond counting, it had spread across the soft, undefended underbelly of the multiverse, a silent, creeping infection moving from one trembling consciousness to the next, a virus that used terror as both its vector and its payload. It had never encountered a mind it could not warp, a heart it could not corrode with the acid of remembered sorrow, a soul it could not dissolve into the chorus of its hive. It was a hunter that had operated for so long, with such utter supremacy, that it had forgotten the very sensation of being hunted. It knew only the passive, welcoming tremble of prey. Its latest incision into the fabric of existence was a masterpiece of invasive subtlety, a surgical strike against the membrane of a reality. A hairline fracture, no wider than the memory of a single, unforgotten traumatic moment, silently opened. It did not pierce into a vibrant, teeming world of robust life and louder emotions, the usual fertile ground. It opened into a space already saturated, already heavy with the presence of death. This was unusual, unprecedented in its long experience. Most worlds greeted the initial seepage of the Upside Down with a psychic shriek of collective panic, a delicious, energizing wave that primed the ecosystem for full-scale invasion. This world hummed, a low, pervasive, omnipresent thrum of finality, a background frequency of ended things. This was not the wild, chaotic, screeching death of accident, war, or plague. This death was different. It was architectural, contained. It had structure, hierarchy, and a chilling silence. It was a death that had been given ranks and titles and medals and marching orders. A death that reported for duty. Undeterred, for what was order but a more complex pattern of chaos waiting to be untangled. The Upside Down began its work. It did not flood in with a dramatic roar. It permeated with the infinite patience of a gas-seeking equilibrium. Vines, black and glistening like strands of congealed blood held up to a sickly light, extended from the rift's edges into the new atmosphere. Their surfaces were not smooth, but studded with microscopic psychotropic pores that tasted the air, the energy, the very conceptual substance of this place. The air here was thick, resistant. It was laden with a strange cold energy, mana, that felt alien to the dimension's base essence. This energy was orderly, almost crystalline in its structure, forming passive, lattice-like defenses that refused the chaotic psychic pollen, the spores of pure fright, that the dimension instinctively sought to spread. The first spores, like motes of grey, lifeless ash, filtered through the rift and drifted downward. They did not take root in the air or on the psychic landscape. They touched the ambient mana and dissolved, neutralized into harmless background noise before they could seed their corruption. The dimension experienced a millisecond of global recoil, a predator reflexively pulling back its tongue after tasting an unexpected potent toxin on its chosen prey. A flavor of authority. Then its ancient, ravenous hunger reasserted itself. This resistance was novel, intriguing. Resistance was not a barrier. It was a spice, a challenge. It made the eventual, inevitable domination so much sweeter, the psychic consumption so much richer. The dimension pressed harder, widening the fracture by a nanometer, pouring more of its essence into the act of permeation, seeking a weakness in the crystalline order. Far away, in a space that existed both everywhere and nowhere, Sung Jin-Woo sat upon a throne. It was carved from a single mountainous block of obsidian so pure it did not reflect light so much as drink it whole, an absolute sink for luminosity. The chamber around him was a volumetric study in absolute silence. It was not merely quiet, it was a vacuum where sound went to die, where the very concept of echo had been exiled. The air was still, not because there was no wind, but because motion itself had been persuaded to cease. Before him, stretched across a hall of impossible non-Euclidean scale, stood his shadow army. To call them soldiers was to diminish them. They were manifestations of a finalized principle. Legions of silhouettes stood in flawless geometric ranks that stretched into the gloom, knights clad in ethereal plate that seemed to flicker between solidity and smoke, hulking behemoths whose forms hinted at dragons, trolls, and things from older myths, spectral archers with bows carved from condensed void, their strings taut with potential. They did not breathe. They did not fidget. They did not shift their weight. They were not at rest, for rest implies a prior state of labor or fatigue. They simply were. They were the permanent, unwavering answer to a question the universe had long since stopped asking. What comes after the end? They were the administrative body of the answer. His eyes, the color of twilight captured and frozen within deep amethyst, were closed. His consciousness was not asleep. It was expanded, dilated, woven through the vast, intricate network of his domain, like the roots of a world tree made of silence. He felt the pulse of every shadow under his command, not as individual heartbeats, for they had none, but as points of serene adherence to his sovereignty. It was a living map of perfect control, a kingdom where the only law was his will, and the will was calm, eternal, and absolute. Then a flicker. A discordant note in the silent, seamless symphony. It was not an intrusion, not an attack. Such things were impossible here. It was a wrongness, a subtle, almost polite pressure change in the metaphysical fabric he governed. A sensation akin to a single, perfectly spherical drop of ice-cold water forming and falling onto the nape of his neck in a room of absolute zero. A tiny anomaly in the perfect sheet of his authority. His eyes opened. There was no startle, no widening of pupils, no quickening of breath. His head turned a precise, calculated fraction, as a man might track the flight of a distant bird across a vast, featureless sky, a motion of observation, not alarm. The anomaly was not in soul. It was not on the physical earth he had been appointed to protect and had, in turn, made a part of his domain. It existed in an adjacent layer, a parasitic pocket dimension that clung to the skin of that reality, like a burr on fabric. A place of echoes, psychic residue, and stagnant emotional energy. His senses, honed beyond human or even monstrous limitations, perceived it with crystal clarity. A realm steeped in ancient, terrified death. Not the clean, final death he administered, but a death that had been afraid when it happened. A death that had left behind a screaming ghost in the very atoms. A graveyard where the corpses had not been permitted to rest, where their final moments were played on a loop to power the ecosystem. And now something within that graveyard was stirring. Not awakening, it was always awake, it was reaching. Something invasive, predatory, and hungry was probing outward from that realm of echo screams, seeking new soil. And it was feeding on the very psychic terror that saturated its own air. A predator, encountering another predator's marked territory. He stood. The act was seamless, a transition from absolute rest to absolute readiness with no intermediary stage. The shadows pooled at the base of his throne deepened, swelling as they claimed the scant, fugitive light in the chamber without a sound, a gesture of allegiance. He issued no command. He gave no glance to the legions before him. Their understanding of his will was not telepathic. It was systemic, axiomatic, as involuntary as a heart beating, as certain as a stone falling. They were not servants. They were extensions of his sovereignty, limbs of a vast, dark body. He took a step forward. The space before him did not tear with a scream of ruptured physics. It did not strain or glitter with forced magic. It folded. It acquiesced with the quiet, natural deference of a servant opening a door for its master, of water parting before a ship's prow. Physics in that singular moment chose obedience over its own laws. One moment he was in the cavernous, soundless cathedral of his throne room. The next, the sole of his boot met the yielding, spongy, and faintly warm earth of a forest that had never known sunlight, that had never known true life, only a grotesque parody of it. The Upside Down greeted him. The assault was immediate, total, and multi-sensory, an environmental indictment designed to break sanity in the first 3 seconds. The air was a physical presence, a throat thick and cloying, packed with the taste of organic decay, not fresh rot, but the deep, settled rot of things forgotten in damp basements for centuries, and the high, metallic tang of long-dried blood. It pressed against the skin, not as wind, but as a clammy, sickening weight, like being wrapped in a lung breathed by a million corpses. The trees surrounding him were not trees. They were grotesque, skeletal parodies. They were petrified nerve endings from some leviathan's chronic pain response, twisted and knotted into permanently agonized shapes, their bark resembling cracked, fossilized epidermis. They did not sway. They ached. The ground itself was alive in the worst way. It pulsed beneath his feet, a slow, rhythmic, muculent throb that was less a heartbeat and more the death rattle of an entire continent, a subcutaneous tremor of perpetual dying. And in the distance, piercing a sky the color of a week-old bruise, an ugly melange of purple, yellow, and green, was the jagged, flesh-like spire of a spore tower. It pulsed with a dim, malevolent crimson light from deep within its fleshy lattice, the rhythm lazy and confident, like a dying coal still clinging to heat in the belly of a beast. It was the beating heart of this localized infection. Beneath and woven through it all were the whispers. They were not voices forming words. They were the raw, emotional ghosts of voices, packets of pure, unfiltered sensation. Run, hide, he's coming. It hurts. They're lying. Forget me, remember me, no one is coming. It's inside you. They skittered at the very edges of auditory and psychic perception, a psychic static designed to bypass reason, language, and higher thought to see directly into the fertile, deep soil of primal, limbic fear. This was the dimension's language, its atmosphere, its first and most insidious line of defense. Jin-Woo took a slow, deliberate breath. The toxic, psychic-laden air flooded into his lungs. The complex biological poisons and corrosive psychic irritants within it traveled down his trachea and met the boundless, cold, still sea of his internal mana. The reaction was not an explosion, not a struggle. The pollutants were simply quenched, neutralized, dissolved into nothingness as a drop of acid might vanish in an ocean. The whispers, that relentless psychic static, reached the fortress of his mind. His consciousness was not a structure built on the fragile, associative architecture of human memory and emotion, prone to cracks and hidden chambers. It was a monolith, a citadel built upon the bedrock of absolute, uninterrogable authority. The whispers found no purchase, no forgotten traumas to resonate with and amplify, no secret fears to tap into, no narrative of vulnerability to exploit. They slid off the sheer, seamless face of his will like rain-down angled glass, leaving no trace, no dampness, nothing. He began to walk. His footsteps made no impression on the soft, pulsing ground. He left no trail, no footprint. He was a shadow moving through a greater shadow, a deeper darkness passing through a world of shallow dark. The reaction from the realm was instantaneous. The vines closest to his boots, thick rope-like things that had been creeping forward, recoiled. It was not a conscious retreat, for they possessed no consciousness. It was a sensory reflex, a biological imperative. They were the dimension's taste buds, its primary sensory organs, and they had just tasted a perfect void. They could sense, could almost see the fear in the soil, the psychic scars and fossilized terror of every victim who had ever wept, screamed, and died here. It was their nectar. From the man now walking among them, they tasted nothing. No fear, no anger, no curiosity, no triumphant malice, not even cold intellectual interest. Only a profound gravitational certainty, a walking event horizon, a black hole given human form. From the thick, rolling fog that clung to the bases of the nerve tree trunks, shapes detached themselves with silent, lethal grace. Demogorgons. Their forms were sleek, alien, a biomechanical nightmare of efficiency. They were built not just for hunting, but for inspiring a terror that was both visceral and utterly otherworldly. As they focused on him, their cranial petals unfolded with a wet, tearing sound that was meant to evoke the opening of a fatal wound. The rows of teeth they revealed were needle-sharp, but they existed less for the practical purpose of consumption and more for the abstract concept of being torn apart, eviscerated, unmade. They moved with a liquid, predatory grace, circling him in a wide, practiced arc, their low, clicking growls vibrating in the thick air, a sound frequency engineered by either evolution or conscious design to trigger the oldest, most reptilian parts of a mammalian brain, to scream predator in a language older than words. They looked at Jin-Woo. He looked back, his gaze passing over them, as one might note interesting but ultimately irrelevant rocks on a path. He did not alter his pace. He did not slow, did not speed up. He did not raise a hand in a defensive posture or summon a weapon to hand. He simply continued his uninterrupted walk toward the distant, pulsing heartlight of the spore tower. The Demogorgons hesitated. Their hive mind, a vast, distributed network of predatory instinct and shared sensory data, sent the standard, uncompromising imperative: assimilate, corrupt, break, incorporate. But the feedback returning from their senses was chaotic, nonsensical, a cascade of error messages. Target invalid. Biological signature, inconclusive. Psychic signature, not detected. Fear frequency, unavailable for amplification. Accessible memory matrices for weaponization, 0. Emotional resonance, null. Threat assessment protocol, error. Rerouting, error. Defining parameters, error. Driven by base-level programming, by the simple, hardwired command to attack that which does not register as the hive, one of the creatures broke from the circle. It lunged, its powerful leg muscles propelling it forward in a blur of pale, sinewy motion. Its claws, capable of rending reinforced steel, reached for the exposed throat of the unmoving man. It never made contact. A spike of absolute darkness, sharper than the absence of light, colder than the void between stars, erupted from the pool of shadow at Jin-Woo's heel. It was not summoned with a thought or a gesture. It was presented, as if it had always been there, waiting for this exact moment to make its existence known. It took the Demogorgon in mid-air, piercing with unerring precision through the complex muscular base of its unfolding petal jaw and exiting through the top of its chitinous skull. There was no spray of ichor, no final spasm of death, no gurgle. The darkness of the spear itself seemed to drink, to actively consume the creature's substance. Flesh, bone, chitin, and the strange animating psychic energy that served as its life force were siphoned away in an instant, dissolving into fine black motes of nothingness that were reabsorbed into the surrounding gloom. In less than the span of a human heartbeat, the Demogorgon was gone, not killed, unmade, erased from the local record of existence. its data formatted and its constituent parts returned to the raw potential of the void. The remaining creatures froze, their predatory circles halting. The hive mind, an entity that had processed 1 billion screams, 1 trillion moments of panic, encountered a data type for which it had no file, no protocol, no conceptual framework, inevitability. This was not a stronger force. It was the negation of the very game being played. Jin-Woo did not spare a glance for the vanished attacker. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, on the throbbing, crimson source of the infection. He had understood the fundamental, operating principle of this realm within moments of his arrival. Its power, its very ecology, its reason for being, was built upon a single, trembling, unstable pillar. Fear. It ruled through it, expanded with it, metabolized it, and was ultimately dependent upon it. And he was the entropy that all fear ultimately, secretly feared. He was the silence after the scream, the finality that made the trembling pointless. The realm itself seemed to shudder in a wave of systemic denial. The ground trembled, not from any power he exerted, but from a deep, core-deep panic resonating up through its substance. The distant spore tower flared violently, as if stung, bathing the entire landscape in a sudden, shocking wave of sick, bloody light that made the shadows leap and writhe, except for his, which remained perfectly still and dark. The whispers coalesced, amplified, merging into a single psychic shriek that was both a sound in the air and a razor-wire scourge against the mind. It was a mental tsunami designed to shred sanity, to scour personality, to reduce any intruder to a quivering, hollow, and utterly receptive shell, ripe for the planting of the hive's will. The psychic wave hit Sung Jin-Woo and broke against him like the gentlest ocean spray against a cliff face of primordial granite. His coat stirred, as if caressed by a breeze, but the air was dead, preternaturally still. He stood at the calm, absolute epicenter of the silent, screaming storm, utterly, completely, and disdainfully unmoved. In that moment, a realization did not dawn within the ancient, distributed consciousness of the Upside Down. It detonated. It was not a thought, but a chilling, fundamental, reality-altering recalibration. This was not a victim. This was not a resistant morsel to be slowly, enjoyably digested. This entity possessed a will it could not infect, a mind it could not break, and a heart that held no terror. Not a suppressed terror, but a fundamental absence of terror, for it to consume. The predator, for the first time since it had slithered from the primordial darkness between worlds, was not looking down upon prey. It was in the presence of its landlord, and with a silent, unspoken decree, the lease on its terrified reality had just been terminated. The silence that followed the psychic roar was not an absence of sound. It was a new, terrifying quality of silence, dense, electrically charged, and profoundly shocked. It was the silence of a god's temple after a sacrilege has been uttered, of a perfect machine encountering a command syntax it cannot begin to pass, of a supreme predator whose instinctive, flawless lunge has met not flesh, but a perfect, depthless void. The creeping vines, those tendrils of the dimension's will, lay utterly still, their tips curled inward upon themselves like the burned fingers of a corpse, a reflexive withdrawal from an intolerable stimulus. The grey, drifting spores hung suspended in the thick, soupy air, no longer carried on the purposeful, subtle currents that spread corruption, but simply stuck, as if time itself had slowed in a radius around the dark figure. The entire Upside Down, a dimension that was itself a form of awareness, seemed to hold a single unified breath. Its million fragmented, distributed senses, the light-sensitive flesh of the lurking Demogorgons, the tremor sense of the Demodogs buried just beneath the surface, the chemical-tasting pores on every vine, the psychic receptors in every floating spore, all focused with a hyper-clarified, unnerving intensity on the solitary dark figure standing, unmoved, upon its poisoned and pulsating soil. The dimension was watching, not with eyes, but with the totality of its predatory being. It was the gaze of a forest that had suddenly realized one of its trees was an imposter made of stone. The failure of the psychic assault, a weapon that had never, in all its eons of predation, failed to find a crack, a trauma, a hidden chamber of fear to exploit, triggered a cascade of deeper, more primal protocols within the vast distributed hive mind known as the Mind Flayer. Its prime directive, woven into the fundamental strings of this parasitic reality's existence, was absolute and simple. Locate consciousness, infect it, corrupt its unique light, and absorb its spark into the dull grey hole. Resistance was expected. It was a welcome flavor of fear, a piquant spice that made the eventual assimilation all the sweeter. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of the unknown, all were just different notes in the symphony the Flayer conducted. But this was not resistance. This was nullification. The anomaly emitted no fear frequency whatsoever. It offered no psychic handle, no emotional lever to pull. It presented no mind to dominate, only a surface of perfect reflective calm. It was a perfect walking occlusion in the Flayer's perceptual field, a hole in its reality, faced with an existential error it could not compute, a paradox that threatened the logic of its own existence. The ancient consciousness defaulted to its most fundamental brute force solution, overwhelming, annihilating physical force. If the void could not be infected, reasoned, or understood, it would be buried, smothered, drowned in a screaming, churning tide of sheer, mindless biomass, until even nothingness was forced to acknowledge the crushing, fleshy reality of the hive. The very ground around Jin-Woo convulsed. It was not a localized eruption, but a synchronized, cataclysmic event. In 1,000 points around him, the earth exploded upwards in gouts of wet black soil and writhing, root-like tendrils that flailed like the severed nerves. From these geysers of filth, Demogorgons erupted. These were not the scouts from before. These were the true warriors of the hive, larger, their carapaces thicker, streaked with hardened, bioluminescent patterns that glowed with a sullen red rage. Their petal maws were already distended in silent, perpetual shrieks as they breached the surface, their forms dripping with the dimension's vital fluids. Simultaneously, from the gnarled, nerve-like trees that formed the forest, the smaller, faster demodogs poured forth. They moved in a skittering, clicking tide, their movements a nightmarish fusion of insectile speed and reptilian aggression, a swarm of living razor blades. And from high above, from the throbbing, fleshy membranes of the distant spore towers, creatures with wings of stretched, vascular skin and cartilage detached themselves with wet, tearing sounds. They filled the bruised crimson sky, a swirling, shrieking vortex of claws, teeth, and tattered wings, blotting out the feeble, sickly light and casting the landscape into a deeper, moving darkness, punctuated by their piercing cries. This was not an army gathering for battle. It was an ecosystem declaring total war upon a single point of infection. The air itself vibrated with the collective, mindless hunger, a tsunami of fangs, talons, and blind consumption aimed with unified, hive-driven purpose at the calm, dark epicenter. Jin-Woo did not look up at the swarm darkening the already dim sky. He did not tense the muscles in his shoulders or back as the tidal wave of chitin, sinew, and gnashing teeth surged from the twisted forest towards him. His expression remained one of detached, almost academic observation, as a scientist might watch the predictable patterns of an aggressive but ultimately simple-minded insect colony. There was no fear in his eyes, no anticipation of violence, only a calm assessment. His gaze, instead of rising to meet the threat, actually lowered. It was not a gesture of submission or fear, but one of profound focus. He looked down at the pool of shadow cast by his own form upon the pulsating ground, a black stain that was paradoxically, impossibly darker than the ambient gloom of the Upside Down, its edges sharp and defined, stretched long and knife-like by the malevolent throbbing glow of the nearest spore tower. His lips parted. A single word, spoken not to the air, not to the approaching horde, but to the very fundament of reality, upon which he held unshakable sovereignty. Arise. The word carried no volume, yet it did not fade. It did not echo in the caverns of the world, but in a deeper place. It resonated not in the ear, but in the soul, a decree that vibrated in the silent, dusty halls, where death itself kept its immutable records. From his shadow, the darkness did not spill like a liquid, it unfurled. It was a motion of revelation, not expansion. It was a fabric, a banner of absolute night asserting its claim over the territory beneath it. And from this unfolding void, they answered the call. Igris, the blood-red commander, was the first to solidify. His crimson armor, a violent, shocking splash of color in the monochrome hellscape of grays, browns, and bloody crimson light, did not appear in a flash or a puff of smoke. He manifested in a gradual deepening of form, as if stepping through a curtain of thickened, concentrated shadow, becoming more real with each passing microsecond. He did not draw his legendary sword from the scabbard at his hip. He simply stood, a statue of grim and impeccable duty, his helm turned with mechanical precision towards the incoming tide of flesh. He was a dam made of will. Behind him, rank upon perfect geometric rank, the shadow soldiers manifested. Their arrival was a wave of silent crystallization. Their forms were fluid for a moment, shifting between the archetypes of armored human knights and bestial, hulking warriors, before settling into their chosen battle forms with a final, silent click of solidified intent. And then, as one, their eyes ignited, not with fire, but with a steady, cool, electric blue flame. 100, 1,000, 10,000 points of identical light. A galaxy of unwavering, obedient stars blooming in the artificial night. There was no hatred in those lights, no fury, only presence, only readiness. Then came the behemoths, the living siege engines of the Shadow Army. Iron, whose name was his nature, fully materialized. His sheer, impossible mass caused the pulsing, spongy ground to compress and shudder with a low, subsonic groan of stressed reality, a localized gravity well of silent menace. Beside him, Tank locked into existence not with a tremor, but with a deep, resonant clang of finality, as if the very concept of bulwark had been forged into a physical form and slammed into the earth. His iron-plated body was a wall that denied the possibility of passage. The Shadow Army stood assembled. They did not roar a challenge to the shrieking sky. They did not beat weapons against shields or chests. They did not snarl or shriek in reply. They held their flawless formations with a silence that was more intimidating, more psychologically oppressive than any war cry could ever be. They were geometry imposed upon seething chaos, a living, breathing proof of order in a realm that knew only the predatory anarchy of consumption and fear. The wave of the hive mind crashed into them. The collision was not of two armies clashing. It was the collision of two opposing, mutually exclusive natural laws. A Demogorgon, moving with blinding speed, launched itself at a Shadow Knight, its claws extended to eviscerate. The knight did not raise its shield. It did not step aside. At the exact point of contact, the knight's form liquefied. Its substance became a grasping, sentient darkness that engulfed the attacker's limbs and head in a grasp colder than the interstellar void. The Demogorgon struggled for a fraction of a second, a silent twitching caught in a black amber, before being pulled entirely into the soldier's reforming mass. It was extinguished, not just killed, but assimilated into the shadow stuff itself, without a sound. Elsewhere, a demodog, lower and faster, darted in and sank its needle teeth into the shadowy calf of another soldier. The darkness did not tear or give way. Instead, it reacted. It flowed up the creature's muzzle, a silent, swift, and utterly horrifying reverse infection. The darkness filled the Demogorgon's mouth, poured down its throat, flooded its lungs, and finally shone out from behind its own eyes like a stolen light before the beast went utterly, permanently limp. It was consumed from within, its physical form becoming a temporary vessel for the spreading shadow. Iron simply continued to walk forward, an unstoppable continental plate. Demogorgons and Demodogs threw themselves against his legs in a frenzy, only to shatter like brittle porcelain hurled against a cliff of black granite. Their forms didn't just break, they dissolved upon impact into dissipating mist that was then absorbed by the lengthening shadows around the giant's feet. Jin-Woo observed it all, his analytical gaze tracking the patterns, the flow, the tactics. The hive mind was intelligent in its own horrific way. It was sacrificial. It was learning. He saw it sacrificing its frontline creatures, not with any hope of victory in that moment, but to gather data, to adapt. Seeing that individual shadows could absorb single attackers, the hive mind changed its tactics with a speed that was almost admirable. Dozens of creatures now swarmed single shadow soldiers, piling onto them in squirming, shrieking mounds of biomass, a strategy of pure brute force saturation. They sought to bury the individual voids under the sheer, smothering weight of rotting flesh, to overwhelm the silence through deafening, chaotic numbers. A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Jin-Woo's demeanor. The slightest narrowing of his amethyst eyes, a microscopic tightening at the corners. He issued no vocal command, gave no signal, but a new, silent order pulsed through the seamless, instantaneous network of his sovereign will, a new line of code written into the operating system of the battle. On the battlefield, a new phenomenon began. From the puddle of dissipating ichor and dissolving tissue where the very first Demogorgon had been unmade, the ground itself seemed to grow darker, not with blood, but with concentrated absence. Then, a shape pulled itself upwards from this patch of deepened gloom. It was a Demogorgon, but rendered in perfect, elegant shades of obsidian and charcoal smoke, its outline sharper, more defined, stripped of the messy biology of its former self. Where its fleshy, petal-like face had been, there was now a smooth, armored plate, etched with a thin, elegant filigree of cool blue light. It rose to its full height with a silent, lethal grace, turned with the precision of a machine, and lunged at the nearest living Demodog. Its shadow claws, sharper and cleaner than their organic counterparts, tore through the living chitin with terrifying, silent efficiency. All across the chaotic field, the same blasphemous, inverted resurrection played out. Wherever a creature of the Upside Down fell, Demogorgon, Demodog, even the shattered, twitching remains of the flying creatures that had crashed to earth in pieces, their shadow would deepen, thicken, and then stand again. Each one was reborn, not to the chaotic, screaming, psychic chorus of the hive mind, but into a profound, clean silence. Their old connection was not just broken, it was surgically severed by a scissors made of absolute silence and replaced. In its stead was a new tether, clean, direct, and unbreakable, humming with purpose, leading back to the single sovereign will of the Shadow Monarch. This was not a battle of attrition. It was systemic conversion, a hostile, silent corporate takeover of death itself. For every soldier the hive mind spent, the monarch's portfolio grew. His army expanded not through recruitment, but through a chilling, efficient, retroactive acquisition of assets. A new, jagged signal began to bleed through the psychic network of the Upside Down. It was not a scream of physical pain, the hive felt little of that. It was a frequency of pure, undiluted, systemic panic. A foundational terror the dimension had never needed to feel before. The terror of irrelevance, of being rendered obsolete in its own domain, of having its core mechanic, convert the dead into more hive, used against it with far greater efficiency and silence. The creature's attacks, once coordinated by a vast intelligence, lost all coherence. They became frantic, spasmodic, desperate, lashing out. The flying beast abandoned any tactical diving, hurling themselves in suicidal rage at the shadows below, only to be snatched from the air mid-descent by tendrils of living shadow that rose from the ground like the grasping, pleading hands of a world already drowning in a new, incomprehensible authority. Then, the realm itself, as a singular, living, wounded entity, entered the fray directly. It bypassed its now failing biological agents. The ground directly beneath Jin-Woo's boots lost all cohesion. It did not crack. It transformed into a hungry, acidic quicksand, a digestive slurry designed to pull him down into a subterranean chamber meant to dissolve anything over millennia. Before his boots could sink an inch, his own shadow pooled beneath them, not spreading, but solidifying into a platform of pure, impenetrable darkness, holding him aloft upon a disk of void that ignored the physics of the mire below. The air around him thickened in an instant into a viscous, burning psychic jelly, a substance meant to suffocate lungs and dissolve conscious thought into primal soup. The ambient mana that perpetually surrounded him, a personal atmosphere of cold, structured power, simply vibrated at a higher, purifying frequency. The corrupting jelly touched this field and sublimated, turning to harmless, inert vapor before it could contact his skin or cloak. The nerve trees surrounding the clearing, extensions of the realm's own tortured nervous system, bent inward with a chorus of sounds like snapping cartilage and splintering bone. They shattered, hurling thousands of sharpened, bony stakes toward him at velocities that blurred the air. They met an invisible, perfect sphere of concentrated void that hung in the air, 1 foot from his person in every direction. The projectiles did not ricochet. They struck the absolute boundary and shattered into harmless, weightless dust that floated away like grey snow. He was not merely fighting the creatures now, he was being tested by the Upside Down itself, subjected to a full environmental audit. Every conceivable hazard, every psychic trap, every physical law twisted to a hostile purpose was deployed against him in an escalating series, and he was point by point failing every single test. His failure was not one of weakness or insufficiency. It was the failure of absolute, implacable negation. He was a walking, null result in the dimension's laboratory of horror. He took a step forward, then another. His pace was deliberate, unhurried, the same pace he had used when he first entered this world. His shadow army advanced in perfect, silent lockstep with him, a moving citadel of order. Where they passed, the landscape was not scarred, but altered. The crimson, thrumming glow emanating from the spore towers seemed to weaken, not by dimming, but by being overwhelmed. The very photons of that hateful light were absorbed, swallowed by the deepening, living darkness that now trailed in Jin-Woo's wake like a cloak of permanent twilight. A new kind of night he authored with his mere passage. High above, in the turbulent, storm-racked core of the dimension, where the Mind Flayer's consciousness truly coalesced, a place not of location, but of concentrated will, something ancient, furious, and profoundly offended, stirred from its predatory, contemplative slumber. The clouds, which had hung in the same static, tortured formations for millennia, like a frozen brain scan of a mad god, began to move. They began to rotate. Slowly at first, a vast celestial grinding, then with gathering, terrible momentum. They swirled around a central, invisible point, forming a continent-sized, spiraling vortex that dominated the bruised sky. Within that vortex, a shape began to coalesce. It was not assembled from matter, but woven from the very stuff of the dimension's identity, crackling forks of corrupted psychic lightning that wept black smoke, strands of rotting atmospheric matter drawn up from below, the condensed, screaming psychic signatures of a billion digested victims given form and purpose. It was not a body in any biological sense. It was the idea of a body given monstrous stormfront form. The diffuse, oppressive psychic pressure that had haunted the air like a collective migraine suddenly focused. It narrowed from a blanket to a beam, a crushing, invisible pillar of malevolent attention, so heavy and dense it would have flattened cities into paste and liquefied the minds of entire populations into a single screaming thought. It was a will that had not been challenged, had not even been noticed, since before the concept of challenge had any meaning in its cosmos. It was a consciousness that broke lesser worlds not by attacking them, but simply by noticing them with its full regard. On the ground, the shadow soldiers for the first time paused in their relentless advance. Not in fear, such a concept was alien to their programming, but in tactical recognition. The battlefield parameters had undergone a fundamental qualitative shift. A higher tier entity, a commander of the opposition, was formally entering the field. At the center of it all, Sung Jin-Woo finally ceased his forward walk. He lifted his gaze from the silent, spreading carnage at his feet, a carnage that did nothing but enlarge and diversify his forces, and looked up, past the swirling lesser creatures, past the dying spore tower light into the heart of the maelstrom, now dominating the heavens. A wind, generated not by weather, but by the awakening fury of the dimension's very heart, now whipped at his black hair and the edges of his long coat, though the air around him had been perfectly still and dead a moment before. The storm was speaking in the only language it had left, raw, chaotic force. The Mind Flayer was no longer probing from the shadows with disposable limbs. It was no longer testing with psychic whispers or biological pawns. Its full, terrible, undivided, and utterly focused attention was now fully awakened. And it bent downward, like the lens of a burning sun focusing its apocalyptic rays onto a single, insignificant ant, upon the quiet, dark man who had not only walked unafraid into its kingdom of fear, but had, within minutes, calmly and efficiently begun turning that kingdom into a recruiting ground for a rival, silent, and infinitely more disciplined empire. The consciousness that descended was not an attack in any conventional sense. It was an atmospheric replacement, a hostile takeover of local reality's operating system. The very laws of perception within the Upside Down were overwritten, line by line, by the Mind Flayer's focused, furious will. The sky above, already a vortex of storm and malice, ceased to be a sky entirely. It became a vast, pulsing, neural membrane, translucent and sickly, like the underside of a colossal brain. Through veins the size of river deltas, a corrupted yellow light, the color of infection and stale fear, throbbed, pumping a fluid that was not blood but liquefied, distilled memory. The ground beneath Jin-Woo's feet lost not just its solidity, but its identity as ground. It transformed into a shifting, whispering, living mosaic of stolen moments. Underfoot, he did not stand on soil, but on the cold sweat of a forgotten exam, the suffocating guilt of a lie told to a dying parent, the raw animal panic of footsteps closing in a pitch-black alley, the hollow, echoing ache of a beloved's name spoken to an empty, silent room. Each tile of the mosaic was a fully immersive sensory trap designed to resonate and trigger a cascade of associative terror. The very air thickened into a conductive psychic gel, vibrating with 1 billion volts of curated nightmare energy, all of it polarized, all of it seeking a single grounded point of entry to complete the circuit: his consciousness. The world had become a weaponized sensory deprivation chamber, but one deprived of everything except fear. The Mind Flayer, in its eons of cosmic predation, had learned a fundamental truth. Flesh was merely a container, a fragile biodome. Armor was a decoration, a mental construct of safety. Even shadow, it now perceived, was just another tool, a form of energy to be wielded. It aimed past all of it. It targeted what it believed to be the core, vulnerable software that ran every sentient being. A fragile operating system built upon the unstable code of trauma. A network of memories and emotions where fear was not just a bug, but the primary, driving programming language. With the concentrated force of a dying star collapsing into a gravitational pinpoint, it bypassed all physical and energetic defenses it now saw as mere theater. and plunged directly into the warm, dark, supposedly chaotic sea of Sung Jin-Woo's mind. It was ready to seed its psychic corruption, to twist personal memories into snares of despair, to turn loves into exploitable vulnerabilities, to reshape his very sense of self into the walls of a prison it would then hold the keys to. It breached the surface of his awareness and found not a mind, not a sea of churning thought and emotion, but a throne room. The assault began immediately, employing a classic and brutally effective psychic tactic: sensory and memory hijacking. 1 nanosecond, Jin-Woo stood upon the mosaic of whispering fears. The next, he was there, fully immersed, back in the double dungeon of the Kartanan Temple. On the day that had once defined the limits of his weakness, the sensory data was flawless, weaponized to a horrifying degree. The stench of blood, copper-rich and nauseating, mixed with the damp, fungal smell of ancient, unmoving stone. The pain was not a memory, but a present. Lancing agony shooting up his leg from the old, unhealed wound, a perfect replication of helplessness. His body felt frail, his muscles like water, his breaths shallow gasps. Before him, the stone statues of knights, their features grim and merciless, began to move with the grinding sound of rock on rock, their swords scraped free from stone scabbards, the sound echoing like a death knell. Their intent to kill him was not an intellectual understanding. It was a tangible, suffocating pressure in the air, a psychic weight meant to trigger the animal flight response. The Flayer had not invented this memory. It had pulled it from the psychic residue of the world, the echo of his own past terror, and amplified the helplessness 1,000-fold, sharpening it into a psychic shiv aimed directly at the heart of his identity. Jin-Woo felt it, the old, cold, greasy terror of certain, inescapable death. He did not suppress it. He did not fight it. He acknowledged its existence with the detached interest of a historian examining an artifact. Yes, the acknowledgement came. That was the sensation. That was the data point. Then his perspective shifted. He was no longer solely the terrified young man in the dungeon. He was also the Shadow Monarch, observing the scene from a third elevated vantage. As the first stone knight lunged, its bladed tip aimed for his past self's heart, the shadows pooled in the corners of the memory dungeon, corners that had not architecturally existed in the original, cramped space, deepened, swelling with silent potential. From them, a familiar form in crimson armor stepped forth, silent as a thought. Igris, appearing within the memory itself, moved with impossible speed. His black sword flashed, not with light but with a deeper darkness, and cut the stone knight in two before it could take a second step. Then, from every shadowed niche, from behind every crumbling pillar in the fabricated memory, more shadows bled forth. They were not his current soldiers, but faceless, archetypal shadows that subdued the other statues, pinning them in place with strands of darkness before they could move. They formed a silent, protective cordon around the trembling, past version of himself. The memory played out to its inevitable conclusion, his survival, but it was no longer a trauma. It was a historical record, a case file. The emotional payload had been extracted, analyzed, and filed. The event was closed, archived, and placed on a mental shelf labeled Foundation Pre-Monarch Data. A pulse of bafflement, clean and sharp, rippled back through the psychic link to the Flayer. The emotion was alien to it, a system error from a tool that had never failed. It recalibrated instantly. If personal history was inert catalog data, it would target present active attachment, the most potent vulnerability. With exquisite malicious care, it wove a new vision, drawing on the subtle psychic impressions of deep care and loyalty it could faintly sense around Jin-Woo's core. Before him, Cha-Hae-in lay broken on a field of grey stone. Her silver hair, usually a cascade of moonlight, was matted with dark, unreal blood. Her eyes, once fierce and alive, were open and empty, reflecting nothing. Her legendary sword lay shattered beside her limp hand. The emotional resonance of the vision was crafted to be psychically perfect, a direct reflection of his deepest, most quiet love, perverted into the most profound personal loss imaginable. It was a psychic landmine, a detonation of despair, waiting for the spark of recognition designed to trigger a chain reaction of grief, then rage, then ultimately, a shattering, all-consuming despair that would blast open the doors of his psyche and leave it a hollow, receptive ruin. Jin-Woo observed the illusion. His love for her was not a loud, blazing, volatile fire. It was a constant, steady star at the fixed center of his personal cosmos, a point of unwavering warmth, loyalty, and quiet certainty. The Flayer sensed this star, this point of light in the dark mental space, and reacted. It poured the full, corrosive force of its apocalyptic psychic power into it, a beam of pure emotional negativity aimed to trigger a supernova. It sought to overwhelm the star, to turn that constant warmth into a chaotic, consuming, self-immolating fury that would burn out his control. The star did not explode. It darkened. Not with the blackness of grief or extinction, but with the profound, absolute darkness of protection. In the vision, the ground around her fallen form did not crack with violence or upheaval. It fractured with a sound like respectful silence, the cracks spreading in a precise geometric pattern. From these cracks, thousands of hands emerged, not the monstrous claws of demons, but the distinct, recognizable hands of shadow soldiers. Knights in etched plate, mages with staffs, bestial warriors, all those who had fought, died, and been risen under his command. Her soldiers, in a way. They did not attack the vision. They acted as a silent, solemn honor guard. They gently, reverently cradled the illusion of her body, their touch infinitely careful, and pulled it down, not into a grave, but into a deep, serene, and impregnable darkness, a sanctum, a vault within the vault of his mind. The love was not destroyed. It was not weaponized into rage. It was secured, placed in a psychic strongroom guarded by the silent devotion of an entire army. It was rendered utterly, forever, untouchable. A new, jarring signal screeched back through the hive mind's network. Frustration. It was an emotion the Flayer had sensed, harvested and savored in its victims for millennia, but had never experienced itself. It was now drowning in the acid of its own borrowed emotion. It abandoned all subtlety, all artistry. It stopped targeting the personal and aimed directly for the foundational bedrock of consciousness itself. It bypassed the individual and went for the existential, the universal fears written into the substrate of all thinking beings. It projected them, raw and uncompressed, directly into the throne room of Jin-Woo's awareness. The fear of oblivion, the total, perfect, and absolute erasure of his being. Not death, but the certainty that he had never existed at all. That every action, every memory, every connection was a phantom of a phantom, leaving not even a ripple in the endless void. The terror of meaningless existence, an eternity of actions, with no consequence, no purpose, no witness. A nightmare of infinite effort expended in a universe that did not register, did not care, and would not remember. The horror of being a ghost, performing for an empty cosmos. The crushing weight of infinity. His consciousness, his sense of I, stretched across the endless cold vacuum of dead space and infinite time. Not for a year or a millennium, but forever. Feeling the self thin, fray, and dissolve over cons into the background static of the universe, losing all coherence, all identity, becoming just another anonymous point of cold awareness in an ocean of cold awareness. It culminated these into a single, masterful vision of supreme cosmic loneliness. Jin-Woo, the monarch, sat upon his throne of obsidian, but the throne floated utterly alone in an infinite, starless, featureless void. No army stood behind him, no generals awaited orders, no world, no domain, no ripple of his will existed anywhere. There was only the throne and him, and the endless, silent, absolute nothing. His awareness, the last point of reference in existence, was shown thinning, fraying at the edges like old cloth, dissolving over millennia into the absolute zero of solitude. It was the fear tailored specifically for a ruler of legions, the ultimate terror of sovereignty, having absolutely nothing and no one to command. To be a king without a kingdom, forever. Jin-Woo stood within this projection of eternal solitude. He did not rage against the void. He did not weep. He looked out into the infinite silent nothingness, and then with the calm, unhurried certainty of a master programmer writing foundational code, he began to organize it. In the vision, the void itself yielded to his presumption. Shadows coalesced, not summoned from him, but concluded from the sheer potential of the emptiness. They formed into grand, silent citadels of impossible architecture that floated serenely in the dark. They ranked themselves, self-assembling into flawless, endless phalanxes that stretched in perfect parade ground lines beyond the very horizon of the vision. They created a silent, orderly, and eternal procession that transformed the concept of infinity from a terrifying abstraction into a mere logistical challenge, a very, very large parade ground to be inspected. He imposed hierarchy, structure, and taxonomy upon the formless. He gave the endless void a command structure, a bureaucracy of the infinite, with departments of silence and ministers of stasis. The ultimate loneliness, the fear that was meant to be the final argument, was reframed. It was not a terror to be feared. It was merely a very large, very quiet, and currently underutilized domain to be administered. The Flayer did not just recoil. It experienced a psychic whiplash. It was not facing a fortress to be besieged or a wall to be scaled. It was pouring water, the water of fear, into a bottomless ocean. Every fear it injected was being metabolized. Stripped of its emotional payload, its energy harvested, its conceptual framework broken down and filed away as neutral data. Every trauma was catalogued, every nightmare was being conscripted, its aesthetic and emotional energy repurposed as raw material for the monarch's serene internal landscape. It was not breaking a mind, it was feeding a system whose appetite for order was as infinite and cold as the void it had just tried to portray. Panic, now pure, undiluted, and utterly self-referential, replaced frustration. This was no longer about assimilating a threat, this was about the integrity of its own being. In a final, desperate, all-or-nothing gambit, the Mind Flayer committed the totality of its vast, distributed consciousness. It abandoned finesse, artistry, even strategy. It gathered every shred of its will from the smallest spore to the core consciousness in the storm, and attempted a brute force psychic override. It became a tsunami of raw identity, erasing psychic force. A formatted designed to scour the throne room clean of all existing data, to erase the sitting figure, and to plant its own blazing, chaotic hive mind sigil in the newly emptied space. It sought to become the new tenant, the new operating system, in this terrifyingly orderly and vacant psychic real estate. This was its fatal, irreversible, and prideful error. For the first time since the psychic link had been established, a link the Flayer had initiated and controlled, Sung Jin-Woo actively reached back along it. He did not push against the tsunami. He did not strike at the invading will. Such actions would have implied a conflict, a contest of forces. He simply did the equivalent of turning on the lights. He opened the door to the throne room all the way, removed any filter, and allowed the Flayer's raging consciousness to fully perceive in its totality what sat upon the throne. Not a personality, not a soul, not a human mind, a principle. The monarch's consciousness was not a presence to be argued with or overwhelmed. It was a fact, as immutable and uncaring as gravity or entropy. It was the living, enacting law of a universe where death was not a messy, fearful end, but a calm, inevitable change of management, and he was the sole, appointed, permanent manager. The Flayer experienced it not as a vision or a thought, but as a catastrophic truth download, a data burst of such profound logical finality that it nearly shattered its distributed intellect. A chair, not crafted from stone or metal, but fashioned from the first darkness that existed before light was a concept. An army that was not a collection of individuals with wills, but a single sovereign will expressed in infinite, perfectly obedient, interchangeable forms. A cycle of life and death, not as a natural, wild, or tragic process, but as a calm, endless administrative duty, a vast, silent ledger of souls that required constant, precise balancing. A ruler who had not conquered death through battle or stolen it through trickery, but to whom the very concept of death had willingly yielded its authority, finding in him a more competent steward, the absolute, the end of the argument. The psychic connection did not sever. It inverted. Suddenly, the Flayer's vast, sprawling consciousness, a network threaded through every Demogorgon's instinct, every vine's growth, every spore's purpose, every whispering, hate-filled thought in Vecna's distant sanctum, felt a cold, impossibly precise, and utterly inescapable hand close around its central, defining nexus. It was not being attacked, burned, or torn. It was being audited. Its millions of psychic connections, the sprawling map of its being, were being methodically counted, their signal strength assessed, their utility and efficiency evaluated. Its eons of consumed memories, its library of fears, were being sorted, filed, and cross-referenced against some immense external catalogue. Its very essence, its reason for being, was being placed on a scale of cold, utilitarian logic, and it could feel the silent, impending judgment looming. Useful or redundant? In the physical world of the Upside Down, the colossal, storm-form manifestation of the Mind Flayer writhed in its vortex not with power, but in a spasm of systemic agony. The corrupted lightning that usually arced from its body to ravage the land now reversed course, striking into it from the surrounding cloud walls as if it were being painfully, electrically outlined and defined against the sky, its form fixed and measured. The psychic scream that tore from it then was not a weapon directed outward. It was a visceral, involuntary, biological reaction, the sound of a hive mind, a creature that had only ever known the collective we, experiencing for the very first time the isolating, icy, and uniquely personal spike of individual terror. The terror of being seen, judged, and potentially found wanting by something infinitely greater. On the ground, Sung Jin-Woo's head was tilted slightly to one side, his expression one of deep, analytical listening, as if monitoring a complex stream of data. His eyes, fixed on the writhing storm above, glowed with a soft, steady amethyst light, the only external sign of the colossal internal administrative process now underway. And from the world itself, a new, impossible phenomenon manifested. From the edges of the shadow-drenched battlefield, from the cracked husks of corrupted nerve trees and the fallen, silent spore towers, a thick, liquid darkness began to weep. It was not Jin-Woo's shadow, not an extension of his power. It was the Upside Down itself, bleeding. Bleeding silent, viscous, heavy tears of pure void that streaked down surfaces like black oil, pooled on the shifting ground, and drank the ambient crimson light of the dying towers, muffling the fading, psychic echoes of the Flayer's panic into a thick, sound-absorbent paste. The realm was no longer trying to infect the intruder, to argue with his presence, or to drive him out. It was hemorrhaging the very substance of its old identity, and what bled out was a perfect, dark, and obedient mirror of the calm, terrible, and absolute authority that now stood listening at its heart. Fear did not vanish. It was rendered obsolete. It became a relic, a dead language whose last native speakers were crumbling into dust, its grammar forgotten, its emotional vocabulary now meaningless. The psychic scream of the Mind Flayer, that cosmic, singular howl of individual terror torn from a creature that knew only the collective, did not fade into the usual background whisper of the Upside Down. It degraded, corrupted by the very silence it fought against, into a low, pervasive, sub-auditory hum of systemic wrongness. It was the sound of a universe's operating system encountering a fatal exception error it could not resolve. A continuous blue screen of death tone played across the fabric of reality. It was the white noise of a dying god, the static of a divine signal losing coherence. The bleeding shadows, those viscous, self-propelled tears of void wept by the Upside Down itself, became the silent agents of this quiet, methodical apocalypse. They spread not with aggression, but with the infinite, patient inevitability of a rising tide governed by perfect lunar mechanics. They seeped up the trunks of the nerve trees in capillary action, climbing the petrified agony of the bark like a species of dark symbiotic ivy that consumed not sunlight, but memory of pain. They flowed up the fibrous, fleshy sides of the distant spore towers against gravity, moving like Mercury in reverse, seeking the source of the light. Where the liquid shadow touched, the violent, rhythmic, throbbing crimson bioluminescence, the visual signature of the hive's heartbeat, the proof of its predatory life, would gutter like a candle in a sudden draught. It would sputter, fight for a few weak pulses, and then die completely. It was not replaced by another light, not even by darkness in the sense of shadow. It was replaced by a cool, depthless indigo that seemed not to illuminate its surroundings, but to define space by absorbing all other possible definitions of it. The area simply became that color, that specific shade of void, a statement of fact. The Upside Down was not being burned, shattered, or razed in a cataclysm. It was being meticulously, cell by psychic cell, irrevocably reformatted. Its file extension was being changed. Sung Jin-Woo resumed his walk. His footsteps, which had once been the cautious movements of an intruder in a hostile land, now established a steady, unhurried cadence, a metronome click for a world that was learning, note by terrible note, a new and utterly foreign rhythm. The Shadow Army moved with him, an extension of his will, not as a conquering force celebrating a victory, but as a wave of silent administrative reclamation. They were the cleanup crew, the systems engineers following the architect. They approached the writhing black vines that formed the Dimension's muscular system, the same cables that had once strangled worlds and pumped fear nutrients through the ecosystem. The soldiers did not draw blades to burn or slash them. As they passed, the shadows that perpetually pulled and shifted around their feet simply touched the organic cables. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. The vines grew instantly, perfectly still, as if flash fossilized mid-motion, captured for eternity in their last pointless writhe. Then, over the span of 3 seconds, their substance underwent a silent transformation, from flexible, wet, living tissue to a brittle, grey, porous material resembling pumice, and finally into a fine, carbon-black dust that lost all cohesion. This dust did not blow away. It settled gently into the deepening gloom underfoot, becoming one with the new, sterile substrate of the realm. This was not destruction born of rage. It was a silent, systemic necropsy, a forensic autopsy performed on a still-living ecosystem with every cell, every function being identified, catalogued for the record, and then neutralized with clinical precision. The spore towers were the next critical system to fail, and therefore was a masterclass in silent systems warfare. These grotesque, fleshly steeples were not architecture in any human sense. They were organs, psychic amplifiers, transmitters, and neural nodes in the Flayer's vast distributed nervous system. They pulsed, not with blood, but with concentrated broadcast band emissions of raw fear, assimilation commands, and the psychic static of pure, undiluted domination, the hive's propaganda and central nervous signal combined. A squadron of winged shadow soldiers, their forms sleek and silent as raptors forged from solidified night, descended from the darkened sky upon the nearest tower. They did not attack it with claw, energy blast, or physical force. They alighted upon its quivering, membranous surface with the delicate grace of birds landing on a branch. And then, with a dreadful, unnatural gentleness, they simply sank. Their bodies lost cohesion, liquefying into a pure black fluid that merged with the tower's structure, not damaging it, but permeating it completely, like a drop of black ink dispersing in a glass of water, coloring every molecule. From deep within the tower's core, now infused with this foreign darkness, a faint, rhythmic blue light began to pulse, once, twice. A clean, cold, digital signal in the midst of churning biological corruption. It was the new system performing a diagnostic, overwriting the old code. The tower's external fleshy throbbing ceased abruptly. A profound, unsettling stillness overtook it. The stillness of a heart that has just received a lethal, precise injection of potassium chloride. Then, without a groan of collapsing matter, without a crash or a tear, the entire fleshy edifice imploded inward. It did not fall into a pile of rubble or burst into ichor. It melted, collapsing in on its own structure, like a time-lapse of a decaying flower, until all that remained on the spot was a perfectly circular, perfectly still, and perfectly black pool of obsidian liquid. The pool reflected nothing, not the sky, not the surrounding trees, not even the concept of light. It was a void, a deleted node in the network, a line of code replaced with a null value. With each tower's silent liquid fall, another major portion of the hive mind's psychic map didn't just go dark with static or interference. It went dark with absolute null signal. The oppressive, smothering psychic pressure that had once blanketed the dimension like a wet, heavy woolen blanket now developed holes, dead zones of profound, echoing quiet. In these zones, a new, qualitatively different silence took hold. It was not the empty, hollow silence of a vacuum, which speaks of absence. It was the full, resonant and pregnant silence of a grand, empty cathedral moments after the last, lingering note of a requiem mass has faded. A silence held and amplified by the vaulted stone and stained glass. A silence that contains the ghost of the structure's purpose. It was a silence of concluded business. The human victims felt the change first, a shift in the fundamental weather of their souls. Scattered across the hellscape, trapped in the dimension's various digestive and sensory organs, some encased in cocoons of hardening psychic slime that fed on their slowly leaching memories, others wandering in brainwashed, shambling herds, their minds hollowed out and repurposed as mere biological terminals. Their eyes seeing for the hive, their ears hearing for the hive. They were prisoners of a nightmare that used their own voices, their own most intimate memories, as the unbreakable bars of their cell. As the towers fell and the shadow seepage permeated the psychic fabric of the realm, like a neutralizing agent, the constant, whispering psychic chorus in their skulls began to break up. The signals jammed, the curated mantras of despair. You are alone. You are afraid. You are forgotten. You are worthless. You are ours. You have always been ours. Stuttered, skipped words, repeated fragments nonsensically and began to fade into incoherent, weak whispers before dissolving into total mental static, and then into nothing. A young woman, her eyes sheathed in the milky, core-like film of the Flayer's direct control, stumbled to a sudden, jerky halt in the middle of a petrified bog. She had been walking a predetermined, endless patrol route for years, her body a rented vehicle. A memory, clear and bright, flashed before her mind's eye. Her younger brother's laughter on a summer day, the smell of cut grass, the feeling of a popsicle dripping on her hand. The hive had always used this memory as its most exquisite lash. It would follow the joy instantly with the crushing, amplified psychic weight of his death, of the absence twisting the beauty into the deepest possible grief to keep her compliant and despairing. This time, the corrosive, amplified sorrow did not follow. The memory played out, beautiful and bittersweet, and ended. In its wake, instead of the hive's manufactured tsunami of grief, a simple, clean, and profoundly human ache settled in her chest. It was her ache, her sorrow, unamplified, unweaponized. Just a memory, now truly hers again, beautiful and sad. She blinked. A single, hot, authentic tear welled up from beneath the milky film, broke free, and cut a stark, clean, vertical track through the grime and psychic residue caked on her cheek. It was the first autonomous, uncurated, self-directed action her body had performed in years. She did not know who she was yet, but she knew for the first time that she was someone. Elsewhere, a man had been sealed in a cocoon for what felt like lifetimes. Suspended in a nutrient bath of his own fears, he felt the organic root-like bindings around his chest and legs loosen. They did not tear with a satisfying rip, nor snap under pressure. They unraveled, their complex biological weave coming apart at the molecular level, as if the commands sustaining their form had been rescinded. The bindings turned into a dry, inert, grey dust that sifted away from him like sand through fingers. He fell, naked and gasping, to the shadow-stained ground. The air he sucked in was still cold, alien, and thin, but it was no longer thick with the psychic poison that had been his atmosphere. The fear was still there, a primal animal terror of the otherworldly, towering landscape and the silent, dark figures moving in the distance. But it was no longer amplified, no longer curated, shaped, and focused into an inescapable existential despair. It was just fear, a raw, manageable, biological emotion. A thing he could, with time and a will he was just beginning to remember he possessed, possibly master. He looked up, coughing, and saw standing at the edge of the clearing a knight wrought from solid, shifting darkness, a greatsword held point down before it, in a posture of eternal vigilance. Its glowing blue eyes were fixed not on him, but on the middle distance, watching for threats. It held no malice. It displayed no hunger. It was not interested in him at all. It was simply present. A fact. An element of the new landscape. For the first time since his abduction, something in this hell did not hurt, did not threaten, did not manipulate. It just was. And in its silent, indifferent presence, the world, for a fleeting second, made a terrible, silent kind of sense. Not all transitions were gentle redemptions or returns to self. Some victims had been too deeply integrated, their personalities fully dissolved, their neural pathways completely rewritten to serve as mere relay terminals or storage drives in the hive mind's vast network. They were empty shells that the hive's will had animated. As the Flayer's signal faded from them, they did not wake up. They did not become human again. There was no again to return to. They simply stopped. The animating will, foreign and parasitic though it was, withdrew, and no native consciousness remained behind to flicker back to life. Their bodies, now vacant vessels, slumped where they stood or lay, marionettes with their strings cut. The shadows nearby, attentive and efficient, would then deepen, flow over these still forms like a respectful black shroud, and absorb them without a sound, without a ripple. They were not killed. There was no one left to kill. They were collected, archived. Their biological and psychic data was filed away in the endless, cold storage of the monarch's domain, their essences broken down into constituent parts and added to the raw, inert material of his expanding sovereignty. Recycled. Deep within the tormented, secret heart of the dimension, in a cavern that was less a place and more a tumor of solidified trauma, woven from petrified flesh, shattered clockwork, and the crystallized, screaming psychic impressions of 10,000 victims. Henry Creel, Vecna, felt the foundations of his world, his masterpiece, unravel in real time. He sat upon his throne of living roots, roots that drew sustenance from the suffering of the realm, but the roots were growing slack, their vitality draining away as if the soil itself had turned to ash. The psychic music that was his weapon, his solace, his raison d'etre, the grand, cruel symphony of pain he conducted with the artistry of a damned maestro, was slipping out of key. The notes, once sharp and piercing, flattened into dull tones. The complex, hateful harmonies he wove from anguish dissolved into jarring dissonance, then into noise. The connections to his flock, to the very particles and psychic weather of his realm, grew thin and weak, filled with static, like a once powerful radio signal, succumbing to a vast, encroaching, and utterly silent jamming field. In his mind's eye, he clutched at the thinning, fraying threads of the hive mind, his psychic fingers scrabbling to reassert control, to pour more of his magnificent, righteous, and all-consuming hatred into the system, to flood the dying channels with the pure voltage of his rage and reignite the network. The system no longer accepted his input. It was being overwritten. Line by line, a colder, quieter, infinitely more patient signal was recording over his masterpiece. It was the difference between a screaming man and a falling stone. One made noise, the other simply imposed a new reality through mass and silence. Through 1,000 dying, flickering, and glitching sensory feeds, the last visual inputs from Demogorgons whose eyes were filling with the blue static, the tremor sense of vines going dead and inert, the psychic shrieks of the towers turning into silence mid-broadcast. He saw the advance of the shadow. He felt not a hostile, fiery force opposing him, but a cool, analytical gaze sweeping over the geography of his kingdom. It was assessing, measuring, cataloguing, and repurposing with the dispassionate, efficient relentlessness of a librarian reorganizing a vast and chaotic collection, deciding what to keep, what to discard, and what new shelf it belonged on. This was not the fiery, emotional human opposition of 11, which was a battle of wills he understood. This was not the desperate, clever, scrappy resistance of Hawkins, which was a puzzle to be solved. This force did not resist his reality at all. It accepted it in the way a coroner accepts a body on the slab. It accepted his world, his creations, his victims, and had begun calmly, methodically, turning them into something else, something orderly, something quiet, something that had no need for his rage, his artistry, his pain, something that found his entire, magnificent tortured symphony to be redundant data. A new kind of fury ignited in the core of Vecna's being, cold and metallic, burning without heat or light. It was the fury of irrelevance. The monarch wasn't fighting him for the kingdom. He was demonstrating, through silent action, that the kingdom, as Vecna understood and ruled it, was already a forgotten footnote in a ledger he hadn't even known existed. He was being made obsolete, archived before he was even done creating in his own cathedral of pain. His gallery was being turned into a storage warehouse. With a roar that was equal parts psychic shockwave and the most profound mortal insult he had ever conceived, Vecna rose from his throne. The thick, root-like tendrils that physically and psychically connected him to the very essence of the upside-down stretched taut, quivering and squealed, with the strain of organic cables pushed far past their design limits, fibers snapping with wet pops. He would not be quietly deleted from his own domain. He would not become a museum piece, a curiosity in his own gallery of suffering. He would not be filed away. He severed the connections. The pain was excruciating, but it was his pain, authentic and familiar, and he wielded it as a weapon, a catalyst, focusing it all into the core of his being. He needed his full, undiluted, concentrated power, untainted by the dying network. He would confront this silent king directly. He would teach this archivist of death, this clerk of the grave, that some minds were fortresses built on foundations of such exquisite, refined, and personal pain that they could never be catalogued. Some wills were forged in a crucible of betrayal and isolation so uniquely hot that they could melt the cold, impersonal chains of absolute authority itself. His physical form distorting, shedding the now useless, dying, physical links to the hive like a snake shedding a skin that no longer fit. He stepped forward. He did not walk through space. He stepped through the fabric of his unraveling world, bending the decaying concept of distance and location within his own realm, around his wrathful purpose. He moved unerringly, a guided missile of hatred and magnificent injury, heading toward the calm, dark, administrative epicenter of the storm that was sterilizing his life's work. Above, the transformation was nearing completion. The shadow had reached the very heart of the Mind Flayer's colossal storm form. The entity, once a terrifying, amorphous maelstrom of lightning and rage, was now fully threaded through, embroidered with veins of pulsing purple-black darkness. Its chaotic lightning was arrested, frozen in mid-arc. Its movements were sluggish, strained, like a great beast caught in a net of its own atrophying substance. It was no longer a terrifying force of nature. It was a defined, trapped shape, a leviathan being bound in chains, forged and cooled from its own diminishing, converted mass. And below, standing upon a vast, perfectly smooth and seemingly endless plain of solidified shadow where once there had been a corrupted forest of screaming vines and pulsing earth, Sung Jin-Woo waited. He had felt it. The last, concentrated, superheated knot of defiant will detach itself from the crumbling network. He had tracked its trajectory as it moved toward him with the focused intensity of a falling star, a final blazing spike of hostile data traveling the dying system toward the central processor. It was the original architect, the first cause of this localized fear, the final piece of the old kingdom's puzzle. He did not summon more soldiers. He did not ready a combat technique or assume a preparatory stance. He did not cloak himself in additional power. He simply stood, hands relaxed at his sides, and waited with the patience of a judge whose docket is clear for the day. The petitioner was arriving. The final piece of the old kingdom was presenting itself of its own volition for audit. And the Shadow Monarch, the sole and final authority in this and all matters of ending, was prepared to render judgment. He arrived not with a roar, but with a symphony of shattering glass. The very air around Vecna's descending form crystallized, frosting over instantly with the frozen, razor-sharp echoes of 1,000 fractured memories and severed synaptic bonds, the psychic backlash of his violently self-amputated connections to the dying hive. The crystalline shards tinkled in a non-existent wind, a ghost sound of breaking connections. He descended onto the vast, seamless plane of solidified shadow, as if lowered by invisible wires, his form a gothic living monument to meticulously curated agony. Flesh, warped and reshaped over decades by obsessive hatred and psychic self-sculpting, was entwined with the petrified, root-like remnants of the kingdom he had personally built from the raw, screaming material of other people's suffering. His single, burning eye, a cracked, luminous furnace of personal grievance and world-consuming spite, fixed upon the still, dark figure before him with an intensity that had once unraveled sanity, broken wills, and etched nightmares directly into the brains of victims across dimensions. Sung Jin-Woo stood exactly as he had first entered the Upside Down, as he had stood in his own throne room, a study in absolute poised stillness, a vessel of pure, unmoved observation. He was devoid of any ceremonial posture, any preparatory stance, any hint of anticipation. He was not a warrior bracing for a fight. He was a function awaiting an input. Between them lay not just the measurable distance of meters, but the fundamental, unbridgeable aesthetic gulf of their creations, their very reasons for being. One was a masterpiece of rage, a brutalist sculpture violently carved from the bedrock of personal trauma and inflated into a universal principle. The other was not a creation at all, but a principle itself, the principle of inevitable, silent, administrative authority, granted temporary, convenient human shape. "You take what is not yours," Vecna's voice declared, shattering the intense quiet. It was not a single voice, but a layered, discordant chorus, expertly woven from the stolen timbres and dying breaths of his victims, a mother's heartbroken sob, swallowed by the dark, a friend's final betrayed gasp, a child's confused, fading whimper, calling for a help that never came. It was a psychic weapon engineered on a molecular level to trigger reflexive, empathetic horror in any listener, a hook to snag the soul before twisting that empathy into a sucking vortex of shared despair. You impose your sterile, empty order upon a chaos that is holy, profound. This is not a realm for kings, for bureaucrats of existence. It is a gallery, my gallery, a gallery for the only truth that has ever mattered, the truth of pain, the sacred truth of fear. Jin-Woo said nothing. He offered no counter-philosophy, no manifesto of his own dominion, no justification. His silence was the entirety of his answer, a void that swallowed declarations. His mere presence, his unblinking gaze, was the absolute wordless rebuttal to Vecna's entire thesis, to his life's work, to his shattered godhood. Vecna's clawed, distended hand rose. The air around it did not distort with heat or power. It screamed, a silent, high-frequency psychic keen that would have liquefied the brainstem of any natural creature, a sound of pure, focused wrongness. Before him, hanging in the crystallized air, 4 lances of pure psychic energy coalesced. These were not blunt instruments of force or simple bolts of pain. They were refined, exquisite horrors, each a masterwork of metaphysical cruelty, forged in the furnace of human experience Vecna had consumed and perverted. The lance of the forgotten child, a hollow, keening spear woven from the utter loneliness of a birthday no one remembered, a Christmas morning met with silence, the ache of being an erased footnote in the world's story. The lance of the survivor's guilt, a heavy, crushing pike formed from the corrosive, unanswerable weight of "why me?" The poison that turns every spared breath into a betrayal of the fallen, the joy of survival into a lifelong penance. The lance of the trapped animal, a jagged, frantic spike of pure, mindless, primal terror, the screeching, scrambling, heartbeat in the throat horror of being cornered with no escape, the base fear that predates thought. The lance of the betrayed son, a white-hot, searing javelin of cosmic rage forged from the furnace-hot fury of a fundamental trust violated by the very source of creation. The hatred that can unmake families, worlds, and selves. They bypassed all physical armor, all energetic shields, all conventional defenses. They were not aimed at the body, but at the soul's very capacity to feel emotion, at the core software of consciousness. They were unblockable, inescapable arguments made manifest, the final, profound treatise of a psychic god who believed he had written the only book that mattered. All 4 struck Sung Jin-Woo simultaneously, and they were filed. He did not flinch. His breathing did not hitch. He did not stagger under a weight of sorrow or rage. He experienced each lance in rapid sequential procession, a fleeting, distant echo of a human experience he had long since encountered, fully processed, metabolized for its data, and moved beyond in his ascent. The profound, aching loneliness of the forgotten child was noted compared to the deep, chosen, and sovereign quiet of his own throne room, a solitude of absolute power, never of abandonment. The survivor's guilt was placed on an internal scale and weighed against the countless thousands, perhaps millions of lives his strength, his system, and his direct interventions had preserved across worlds. It was found to be an illogical, inefficient, and irrelevant emotional currency. The animal terror was a faint, guttering spark cast into the monumental, all-encompassing darkness he commanded and was extinguished without a whisper, without even the honor of being noticed as a threat. The betrayed son's all-consuming rage was a single cup, of scalding water thrown into the black, depthless, and immeasurably cold ocean of his authority, absorbed without raising the temperature of that infinite sea a single negligible degree. Vecna witnessed it happen in real time, through his own psychic senses. He saw his most refined, most personally devastating weapons, the very essence of his artistic cruelty, simply register on the entity's consciousness. They were acknowledged with the passive indifference of entries in a vast logbook, ticked off a list, and then vanished without a trace into the vast, cold, and impeccably organized catalogue of the monarch's being. It was not a victory, it was a clerical procedure. For the first time in his long, hate-filled, triumphant existence, a sliver of the very fear he so loved to cultivate, harvest, and savor found a fertile, waiting home in the long, fallow soil of his own heart. He roared, abandoning all subtlety, all artistry, all pretense of higher purpose. The sound was a physical thing, a shockwave of pure fury. The ground of the solidified shadow plane cracked in a massive, spider-web pattern radiating out from his feet, a testament to the kinetic energy he now summoned. Chunks of the shadow substance, each the size of a car, ripped free from the plane, defying their own solidity, and hurled toward Jin-Woo like meteors of darkness. Alongside this physical barrage came visible, distortion wave pulses of concussive psychic force, walls of mind-pulping energy that warped the very light around them. It was a combined, cataclysmic assault, meant to pulp physical matter and shatter any remaining, hidden mental cohesion in one annihilating blast, the last, desperate argument of brute force. Jin-Woo took a single, calm step forward, not away from the barrage, but toward it. From the pool of absolute shadow at his feet, a blade manifested in his right hand. It was not the dagger of quiescence, a named weapon with a history. It was something more fundamental, more abstract, more terrifying in its simplicity. It was the concept of an end, a line of perfect, irrevocable finality given minimalist form. It had no hilt, no edge in the traditional sense. It was a slit in reality, held like a knife. He did not swing it in a mighty, theatrical, battle-hardened arc. He simply drew it with a minimal, almost dismissive movement, making a short, precise, vertical line in the air before him, as if dividing one moment from the next. The incoming cataclysm did not explode on contact with an equal force. It did not collide. It ceased. The hurled rubble of Shadowstone, the visible warping waves of psychic force, the very sound and murderous intent behind Vecna's roar, all met the silent vertical black line and were uncreated. They were not shattered into pieces nor dissipated into energy. They were subtracted from local reality. A perfect vertical scar of absolute nullity hung in the air for a moment, a tear in the fabric of what is, a glimpse of the is-not beneath, before the wounded world stitched itself back together around the absence. This was not defense. It was ontological erasure, the deletion of event and intention. Vecna physically staggered back, not from any concussive impact or blast of energy, but from profound conceptual shock. His entire existence, his methodology, his victory condition was based on addition. He added pain, added fear, added layers of control, corruption, and complexity to the souls and worlds he touched. This was subtraction. This was deletion. It was a mathematical and existential heresy that offended the foundational core of his being. It rendered his magnificent suffering meaningless. Blinded by a hatred now frosted with a layer of primal, unfamiliar terror, Vecna lunged in a final, utterly desperate move. He abandoned psychic warfare, abandoned artistry, abandoned everything that made him a god. He fell back on the most basic animal action, direct physical violation. He charged his powerful biomechanically distorted body, moving with shocking predatory speed across the shadow plane, his clawed right hand, the instrument that had torn through reality and hope alike, aimed to physically tear out the still beating heart of this quiet, impossible, insulting god. It was an act of pure, undiluted personal hatred, the last resort of a tyrant whose every other weapon has been laughed off. Jin-Woo did not parry with the concept blade. He did not evade with a flicker of shadow. With his left hand he reached out, a motion so casual, so effortless, it was in itself a devastating insult, and caught Vecna's hurtling wrist a mere inch from his own chest. The contact was catastrophic. For Vecna. It was not a contest of physical strength, though the grip was immovable. It was a catastrophic unilateral download of hierarchy. Through that point of contact, Vecna's magnificent tortured mind was flooded not with pain or damaging energy, but with structure, with scale. He felt in an instant of overwhelming data the true incomprehensible scope of the army at Jin-Woo's back. Not just the thousands of shadowy forms standing on this plane, but every soul, every vanquished monster, every fallen dragon, every deposed warrior king from 100 disparate worlds who had ever died and been added to the silent, eternal ranks. He felt the staggering cosmic weight of the monarch's duty, the cold, unending administrative responsibility of managing the universe's most fundamental transition, death itself, a burden so vast it made his personal, fiery, all-consuming rage seem like the fleeting, self-indulgent tantrum of a child. He felt the absolute in the unyielding, calm grip on his wrist. It was not a power greater than his. It was the framework upon which power itself was permitted to exist, the rules to a game he hadn't known he was playing. His intricate life's work psychic defenses, his hardened, diamond-sharp sense of self, his magnificent, world-spurning fury, all began to crumble. Not under an attacking force, but under a simple, undeniable, logically complete truth. They dissolved like elaborate sandcastles, not under a pounding wave, but before the inevitable, gentle and all-consuming tide of graveyard certainty, a tide that had been rising since the first thing ever died. "No gallery," Jin-Woo said. His first and only words of the entire confrontation. His voice was devoid of inflection, of triumph, of malice, of pity. It was flat, clean, and merely final. A correction of taxonomy. A library. He applied pressure. Not to the physical wrist he held, but to the concept of Vecna, to the narrative of Henry Creel, to the self-constructed identity of the psychic tyrant. Henry Creel did not break. There was nothing brittle enough left to break. He unmade. His physical form dissolved not into gore, viscera, or even dust. It dissolved into swirling, mournful motes of blackened memory and extinguished pain, like the last embers of a hateful fire blown apart, each spark carrying a fragment of a scream, a moment of torment. His consciousness, stripped of its physical anchor, its intricate psychic defenses, its self-justifying narrative of righteous vengeance and artistic pain, was laid utterly, nakedly bare. It was revealed not as a monster, but as a specimen, a brilliant, terrifyingly complex, and profoundly injured knot of unparalleled will and psychic sophistication. A unique case study of twisted genius wedded to monumental, personal suffering. It was a consciousness, Jin-Woo assessed in the span of a microsecond, worthy of preservation. Not for redemption, but for utility. A valuable, high-quality addition to the collection. Jin-Woo opened his left hand, releasing the dissipating motes. The concept of an end in his right hand dissolved back into his shadow like smoke reclaimed by a greater darkness. He then looked at the swirling, coalescing cloud of essence that had been Vecna and performed the most fundamental, sovereign act of his existence, the act that defined his title. He reached into the cloud with both hands, not to grasp, but to reweave. Tendrils of shadow, finer than spider silk, and more absolute than the laws of physics, emerged from his fingertips and the surrounding darkness. They threaded through the swirling essence with microscopic precision. They did not erase Vecna's memories, his pain, or his formidable, hard-won psychic power. To do so would be wasteful, inefficient. Instead, they bound them. They organized them. The all-consuming, world-poisoning rage was fitted with a silent, immutable governor, a rule in its code that prevented it from being a motive force, allowing it only as a potential energy source. The core, personal hatred for his father, for humanity, for creation itself, was carefully isolated, lacquered in darkness, and placed in a secure psychic vault, accessible only as reference data, never as fuel. The brilliant, strategic, labyrinthine mind, capable of orchestrating dimensional invasions and conducting psychic symphonies of torment, was cleared of its corrosive, egocentric purpose and laid bare, its processes optimized for pure, dispassionate utility. The immense psychic mastery over memory, pain, and fear was preserved in its entirety, its myriad connections meticulously severed from the dead hive network and rerouted, soldered to a single, new, and absolute source of authority. From the coalescing, reorganized mass of shadow and repurposed will, a new form rose, knitting itself together from the feet upward. It was Henry Creel, yet it was not. The grotesque, fleshy distortions, the marks of his suffering and his power, were smoothed, refined, and hardened into an armor of dark, polished chitin, elegant in its severity, functional in its perfection. The burning, hate-filled human eye was gone. In its place was a single, calm, glowing blue ember set into a pale, serene, and utterly expressionless face, a lens of cold perception. The invasive vines and roots that had been both part of his body and his connection to his realm were now sleek, articulated limbs of shadow and fossilized bone, stripped of parasitic need and rendered into elegant, precise tools. The new form completed its assembly and knelt smoothly on one knee upon the shadow plane, its head bowed not to the ground, but in a slight, formal incline. It was not a gesture of groveling submission or broken spirit. It was one of clear, unambiguous, and systemic acknowledgement, a node recognizing its confirmed place in a new, vast, and irrevocable chain of being. General Vecna, the master of psychic warfare, the tactician of terror, the connoisseur and archivist of pain, now newly appointed as the curator of the categorized agony wing, a senior administrator in the service of the Shadow Monarch. Jin-Woo looked upon his new general for a long moment, his gaze analytical, running internal diagnostics, assessing the stability and alignment of the new parameters. A flawless integration. Satisfied, his eyes lifted, past the kneeling form, to the sky above. The massive, struggling form of the Mind Flayer was now completely outlined, infiltrated, and threaded through with pulsing veins of violet-black energy. It was a dying leviathan caught in a net woven from its own diminishing, converted substance, its movements reduced to feeble twitches. The last, centralized, intelligent, defiant will of the old order was gone, transformed, and integrated into the new system. Only the vast, mindless, reptilian hunger of the hive body remained, a final, systemic, autonomic reflex awaiting its administrative resolution. And in the deep, utter, and absolute silence that followed the fall and reorganization of a psychic king, a tremor traveled, not through the ground of this dimension, but across the invisible, resonant strings and subtle membranes that connected this pocket of reality to the wider, breathing multiverse. In distant realms of singing light, in cosmic voids where old things slept, in realities built on principles of flame, order, or chaos, ancient and powerful entities, monarchs of other domains, watchers in the dark, feeders on specific energies, paused. A feather on a cosmic scale had trembled. Something had shifted in the background balance of things. A new, quiet, patient, and utterly undeniable sovereign power had just finished its quiet administrative annexation of an entire dimension of specialized fear. A door that was never meant to be opened had been, and on the other side, Something had not only looked back into the staring void, but had begun calmly, methodically, filing everything it saw. With Vecna's will extinguished, repurposed, and seamlessly integrated into the new chain of command, the Mind Flayer was reduced to its most primordial, larval state. What remained was not a ruler, not a predator, not even a conscious entity. It was pure, idiotic, and infinite hunger. A cosmic tapeworm severed from the brain that had directed its migrations, now just a spasming digestive tract adrift in the void. A reflex, a single gaping, spasming mouth, disconnected from any thought, any strategy, any identity beyond the base impulse to consume. Yet even in this diminished, mindless condition buried deep within its ancient predatory programming, coding written in the language of dead stars, a final, apocalyptic failsafe activated. It was a command older than language. If total assimilation is impossible, initiate total annihilation. If the hive cannot possess and transform, it must erase and deny. If we cannot have it, no one can. Burn the garden. Salt the earth of reality itself. It was the ultimate spite of a parasite, to destroy the host utterly, to leave nothing for any rival power to cultivate, to turn a dimension into a tomb for itself and its vanquisher alike. The dimension, now a mere extension of the Flayer's dying, convulsing nervous system, responded with a catastrophic finality. The atmosphere didn't just tense with anticipation, it contracted, pulling inwards with a sound like the tearing of the world's largest ligament, a violent, suffocating spasm of a lung in its last moment, ready to cough out its own shredded, rotten remains. The very geometry of the Upside Down, already strained and warped, began a catastrophic inversion. In the middle distance, mountains of fused flesh, bone, and petrified terror performed a grotesque. Space itself began to pleat and fold, not along natural gravitational fault lines, but along the raw, bleeding seams of pure psychic trauma, the scars left by every victim it had ever consumed. It was the equivalent of a fatally wounded primordial beast realizing the trap is inescapable and the hunter invulnerable, deciding in its final, defiant agony to bite off not just its own trapped leg, but to chew through the very ground upon which it stood, to swallow the world and choke on it. It would trigger a dimensional collapse, a psychic supernova of corrupted, concentrated fear energy designed to unravel the pocket universe from the inside out, like a knitted sweater pulled by a single thread, reducing it and everything within its borders, including the silent, thieving monarch and his entire army, to a brief, bright flash of screaming nothingness before fading permanently into the featureless static of the true void. Sung Jin-Woo watched the realm convulse in its grandiose, self-immolating death throes. He understood the intent immediately, analyzing it with cold clarity. It was not a strategy he would have ever employed. It was inelegant, clumsy, catastrophically wasteful. To willfully destroy such a vast, organized repository of captured energy, archived memory, and unique dimensional potential was an act of supreme, short-sighted mismanagement. It was the wanton burning of a vast, unique library, a library he had just finished cataloging, simply because the librarian could not bear to let another scholar read its books, an emotional tantrum on a cosmic scale. He raised his right hand, palm open and relaxed, fingers slightly curled, not in a gesture of grasping or command, but of presentation. He aimed it, not at the collapsing landscape, but towards the apocalyptic, throbbing storm form in the sky, the Flayer's corporeal heart and the epicenter of the unraveling. He did not pull at it with telekinetic force. He did not shout a sovereign command for it to cease. Such things were for those who bargained with the unruly, who fought against the current. He was the ocean. He did not fight the river. He accepted it into his depth. He simply opened a door. Within the pool of his own shadow at his feet, a gateway yawned into existence. It did not shimmer, It did not swirl with energy. It was merely an aperture, a stark geometric opening into a deeper dark. It was not a portal to another location in space-time. It was an aperture to the source, the inner sanctum, a realm of absolute preconceptual stillness that existed beneath the basement of reality, behind the back wall of death itself, a place where the raw, unformed potential of all endings resided before being shaped and assigned into specific individual deaths. It was the silent, soundproofed backstage of oblivion, the archive of conclusions, and he held its only key. From his open palm, a vortex bloomed. It emitted no sound, no flash of distracting light, no pull of distorting wind. It was a vortex of silent gravity, a profound and gentle negation of presence. It expanded, not aggressively like an explosion, but with the inevitable, majestic, and total spread of a solar eclipse's umbra, swallowing the light of a star not with violence, but with geometry. It engulfed the collapsing flare, the raging dimensional storm, the inverted mountains, the screaming folds in space, all of it. The entity thrashed within the embrace of this absolute dark. Its chaotic, world-rending lightning, which had moments ago been sketching agony across the sky, became faint, frantic, meaningless scribbles of light against an immense patient void, the last doodles of a dying mind on the wall of eternity. The terrifying dimensional tremors, the sickening folds in reality, the self-cannibalizing mountains, all ceased. Not with a cataclysmic bang, not with a whimper, but with a deep, universe-wide, almost relieved sigh. A release of metaphysical tension so profound, it felt as if reality itself had just let go of a breath it had been holding, clenched in a spasm of horror, since the first moment of its corrupted creation. The Mind Flayer was not torn apart by conflicting forces. It was drawn in, its colossal storm cloud form, a vast tapestry woven from millennia of cultivated fear, psychic dominance, and blind predatory hunger, began to stream, not fall, into Jin-Woo's palm. It flowed like smoke being inhaled by a vacuum cleaner the size of a galaxy, a silent, efficient process of reclamation. He absorbed it, but not as a warrior absorbs the power of a fallen foe to grow stronger. He absorbed it as a scholar absorbs data, as an archivist ingests a new collection. The entire history of the Upside Down, its blind, predatory journeys across the soft tissues of the multiverse, the unique chemical psychic taste of a billion different fears, the genetic and memory imprint of every victim ever assimilated, the complex architectural and psychic blueprint of its self-replicating corruption. All of it was decoded, decompressed, and streamed in orderly packets into the vast, cold, categorized archives of the Shadow Monarch. It was catalogued, indexed, cross-referenced, and linked to related entries on pain, dimensions, and hive mind structures. A new, grim, and immensely detailed wing, cold and silent, was added to the infinite library of conquered ends. The librarian had completed his acquisition. The collection was now complete. The process was utterly, profoundly silent. It took less than a minute. When it was done, the sky was empty, not of matter or cloud, but of intent. The perpetual bruised twilight that was the realm's base neutral atmospheric state remained, but it was cleansed now, inert, just weather. The malevolent, shaping consciousness that had colored it with hatred and hunger for eons was gone, its palette wiped clean to a flat, neutral gray, like a television tuned to a dead channel. Jin-Woo lowered his hand, the motion slow and final. He turned, a slow, comprehensive 360-degree pivot on the heel of his boot, taking in the totality of the transformed world with the assessing eye of a foreman surveying a finished construction site. The change was total, systemic, and chillingly complete. The Upside Down was no longer a kingdom of fear. It was officially and irrevocably a shadow domain, a subsidiary operation of a far greater, quieter empire. The throbbing, fleshy, tumor-like spore towers were gone. In their place stood silent, spiraling obelisks of smooth, flawless shadowstone. Their surfaces were non-reflective, drinking what little ambient light existed and emitting only a soft, directionless indigo glow from within their core, like dormant monitors on standby, displaying a single, serene pixel. The invasive, fibrous vines that had choked every surface were now graceful, geometric structures of black crystal, growing in precise, fractal patterns. They hummed with a low, subauditory harmonic frequency that resonated not in the ear, but in the soul, a single, sustained, foundational chord of perfect, immutable order. The air was cool, dry, and preternaturally still, utterly devoid of floating spores or psychic pollen. It tasted of ozone after a cleansing storm and the dry, faint, inoffensive scent of ancient, well-kept parchment. The twisted, nerve-like forests remained, but as petrified memorials, their horrific forms preserved with museum-like precision and detached respect, but drained of all malevolent life and purpose, rendered inert exhibits in a grand open-air hall of concluded biological horrors. His army stood arrayed across this new, silent landscape, motionless as always, their eternal vigilance now part of the scenery. Among their familiar trusted ranks were now seamlessly integrated the new acquisitions. Demogorgons, with forms streamlined, aerodynamic, and armored in polished darkness, their once gaping petal faces now smooth, sealed plates edged with a thin filigree of cool blue light, their movements precise and silent. The flying creatures, stripped of their shrieking fury and predatory frenzy, now perched upon the new obsidian obelisks like solemn, watchful gargoyles cast in polished obsidian, their forms still and statuesque. And at the strategic forefront, a place of honor and utility beside the unwavering crimson-clad Igris, stood General Vecna. His psychic presence, once a violent, sprawling psychic scream that tortured the air, was now a calm, ordered, and tightly contained field of potential, a scalpel sterilized, calibrated, and sheathed, awaiting its designated purpose in the monarch's service. The human survivors, those few who had endured both the Flayer's long possession and the subsequent terrifying, silent transformation of their prison, huddled in isolated, confused groups. They were not hunted. They were not even acknowledged. The shadows, the soldiers, the very architecture of the new world paid them no more mind than one pays to inert dust settled on a shelf outside the curated collection, a minor environmental factor to be passively ignored. They were simply external to the new operating system. Anomalies, survivors in a world whose core programming had logically concluded that the era of survival, of predation, of victimhood was an obsolete paradigm. It was over. Eventually, as if by silent administrative decree, a stable, calm rift would shimmer into existence near each group, not a tearing wound, but a neat, orderly doorway, an administrative courtesy, an export of irrelevant, unsorted data back to its point of origin. They would leave, and the memory of this place would haunt them, not as the familiar scream-filled nightmare it once was, but as a profound, soul-chilling, and fundamentally unanswerable mystery. The day the breathing, shrieking, living hell they knew had simply stopped and become quiet. Jin-Woo turned a final, slight quarter circle. From the seamless, solid shadow floor where he stood, a throne rose. It was not summoned. It was concluded from the substance of the domain, as natural as a stalagmite in a cave. It was of the same smooth, unadorned shadowstone as the obelisks, devoid of ornament, gargoyles, skulls, or any grandeur. It had a high back and simple arms. It was not a seat for ceremony, intimidation, or display. It was a terminal, the functional, ergonomic chair of a permanent, on-site administrator, placed at the nodal point of the new system. He sat. Across the infinite vibrating filaments and subtle membranes of the multiverse, ripples spread. They were not shockwaves of force, but quiet perturbations in the background hum of existential possibility, felt only by the most sensitive, the most ancient, the most attuned. In a deep underground, concrete-wombed lab in Nevada, banks of analog monitors and sleek digital arrays connected to the long-compromised Project Hawkins suddenly flatlined. The needles did not dance into random noise or spike into madness. They dropped to a perfect, unwavering, unnatural zero-point signature and stayed there. The dimension they had bled into, tortured and monitored for years, no longer registered as a seething pit of chaotic psychic energy. It registered as a perfect silent blank. A hole in the psychic map that wasn't a hole, but a patch of something else. Something that didn't echo. In the cold, lightless depths between the spiral arms of galaxies, an ancient, star-sized entity that metabolized the psychic screams of dying realities, a cosmic saprophyte, turned its manifold, non-local senses toward a familiar, delicious point of chronic anguish in its feeding grounds. It found, instead of the usual nourishing chorus, a sudden, gaping silence. A note gone from the symphony. It did not understand silence. The absence of expected stimulus was to it a form of pain. It lingered, confused and now faintly, inexplicably hungry, probing the quiet with senses built only for noise. In other distant realities, realms of searing, foundational light, gardens of boundless explosive life, empires of consuming, sacred flame, the reigning monarchs and primal powers paused in their eternal workings. A new constant had been added to the multiversal equation, not a roaring conqueror who took by glorious force and fiery proclamation, a curator, a librarian, a power that acquired not through conflict, but through inevitable, silent assimilation. A sovereign whose first action upon encountering a new reality was not to challenge it, but to file it. This was a new and unsettling type of neighbor. The work here was done. The realm was ordered. The rampant, wild fear had been categorized, subfiled, and cross-referenced. The chaotic, self-devouring energy had been efficiently repurposed, integrated, and hardwired into a sustainable, silent, self-regulating system. The new administrator was in place. The army was stationed. The transition was logged. But this was not a victory. Victory implies a contest, a clash of opposing desires, a narrative where one force triumphs over another through superior strength, will, or cunning. This had been a process of assimilation, a systemic correction, a logical, quiet integration of a disordered, dysfunctional subsidiary into the vast, orderly, and silent corporate structure of the Shadow Monarch's domain. There had been no battle for the soul of the place, for it had none. There had been an audit, followed by a restructuring. Sung Jin-Woo, the Shadow Monarch, sat upon his throne in a kingdom that, by all known rights of cosmic horror, emotional logic, and natural law, should not have been able to exist. A realm of primal, emotive, predatory terror had been turned into a silent, efficient, self-sustaining engine of his will. It was not peaceful. Peace implies the cessation of conflict, a sigh of relief after struggle. This was stasis, a perfect, self-maintaining, absolute and eternal stillness. It was not alive with joy or fear. It was functional. And in its perfect silent functionality, it was, in its own way, more deeply and profoundly unsettling than the screaming, breathing chaos it had replaced. The chaos had a passion, a terrible life. This had the quiet of a tomb that also happened to be a perfectly tuned machine. He looked out over the darkened plains, the crystalline structures humming their one eternal note, his legions frozen in perfect ready formation, a tableau of absolute readiness that would never be acted upon. There were no orders to give. The system would maintain itself, reporting only if a new external anomaly was detected. His role here was now complete. He was a signature on a finalized document. His gaze turned inward, away from the external domain, to the vast, silent, endlessly expanding archives of his power. A new, substantial volume had been added, A new shelf, psychically labeled with the precise dimensional coordinates of this place, now held the complete, digested and annotated essence of a predator that had known nothing but fear, that had been fear incarnate. It was no longer a horror to be feared, it was a resource, a case study, a lengthy, detailed footnote in the ongoing, infinite text of his sovereignty. Its data on psychic trauma networks, dimensional adhesion, and fear-based biomass conversion was already being passed for potential utility. Fear ruled this place once. Now it is a page in a book. Order does not scream. It catalogues. The dead did not resist. They were reassigned. The kingdom did not fall. It submitted. And from his throne at the silent, administrative heart of a world that had forgotten how to scream, Sung Jin-Woo watched with eyes that saw everything and sought nothing, and waited with the patience of continental drift, and listened to the profound, engineered quiet he had authored. The cold, gentle, and inexorable tide of his authority had finished saturating this reality, had met its every shore. The osmosis was complete, the solution was uniform. Now patient and eternal, that same tide simply continued its existence, and in existing, its edges, quiet, calm, and absolute, continued their slow, imperceptible, inevitable lap against the distant, still noisy, and less orderly shores of other chattering, tumultuous realities.